Please be seated. There's a great movie, if a bit cheesy, that came out on Netflix this year called The Miracle Club. Has anybody seen The Miracle Club? All right, so you guys can hold me accountable to whether or not I get the story right. It is essentially the story of three women of different ages who live in Ireland in 1967, who all very much want to join their church's group on a pilgrimage to Lourdes. They want to go so badly that they form a rock band so that they can perform in the church talent show so that they can win tickets for the youngest member of their group who cannot afford to buy them. And each of the women has a different reason for wanting to go. The elderly woman, near the end of her life, has had a deformity in her leg her whole life, and people assume that she wants to go to heal her leg. But she just really wants to go to have a divine experience in the place where the Virgin Mary appeared. The second woman is middle-aged. She has 5 children that range in age from toddler to young adult, and she has found a lump in her breast that she is very worried about. And so she is hoping that by dipping in the baths of Lourdes, that the lump will miraculously disappear. And the youngest woman, a young mother, has a 7-year-old child that doesn't speak. And she's hoping that by bringing this child into the water at Lourdes, that he will begin to speak. Now, none of the husbands want the women to go, for varying reasons that is a little bit more complicated than what we need. That none of the husbands want the women to go, but the women all sneak out and go anyway. And the story includes a 4th woman, about middle-aged, who has returned from America for her mother's funeral. Her mother has died. And her mother is close friends with these 3 women and had bought a ticket to go to Lourdes, but had died before they could go. And it's clear early on that there was some long estrangement that this woman had with her mother, and then also with these other women who at some point earlier in her life had been very close to her. And her mother left a note with the tickets telling her to go on this trip. So on the day they are leaving, the women all sneak out of their houses and arrive at this bus, hoping for their miracle. And tagging along is this 4th woman who isn't quite sure what her mother thought she had to gain from going on this trip with these people who clearly don't want her there. Our gospel story today is a beautiful dance between 2 miracle stories, intertwined with parallels and contradictions. Jairus, the leader of the synagogue, arrives, and in a great display, throws himself on the ground in front of Jesus and begs Jesus to save his daughter. And Jesus agrees, and they head toward Jairus' house with a crowd around them. I sort of imagine it as this collection of bees all moving in one direction together. And in this clutter and chaos, this woman quietly makes her way through the crowd so that she can touch Jesus' cloak. And she is immediately healed. And Jesus knows what's happened and cries out, "Who touched me?" And this woman, full of fear, sinks to her knees and tells Jesus the truth. And Jesus calls her daughter and tells her to go away in peace. And then another commotion. This crowd of people come from Jairus' house to give him the news And his child has died, and he should abandon Jesus and wander away. Jesus says, you know what? I got this. Let's just keep going. And they arrive at Jairus' house, and there's more chaos and commotion because there's another crowd there that's weeping and wailing and carrying on. And when Jesus reassures him that things are going to be fine, they laugh. They laugh at Jesus. Yet Jesus steps in and tells the young girl to get up, and she does. And everyone is amazed. It's easy to conclude from these stories that healing is available to all of us. Man or woman, rich or poor, loud or quiet, powerful or disadvantaged. If you come to Jesus and ask, you will receive. But that conclusion makes me a little bit angry. And it makes me pretty uncomfortable. While I believe truly that the promise of the gospel is available to everyone, I'm uncomfortable with the idea that healing always happens, that healing is guaranteed, because we know that physical healing is not always guaranteed. That death itself is inevitable. People get sick. People live with chronic illnesses and degenerative diseases, with terminal illnesses, and medicine can do a lot for us, but not everyone can be cured. Some people die. Well, if we're being really honest about it, everybody dies. There's a great line in one of my favorite country western songs that says, "The highest cost of living is dying, and everybody pays." Some people die too young. Some people die tragically and unexpectedly. Some people suffer for a long time before they die. Or faith will change that. So what do we do with these two beautiful miracle stories that dance around each other? What do we do with these two stories that have a happy ending when so often we do not? The women in the movie arrive in Lourdes and discover that it is a tourist town of all. But they don't care. They're so hopeful and excited to be there. They even really love the gift shop. And they settle into their hotel, which is sort of like a hostel where they're sharing rooms, and there's tension and awkwardness with this fourth woman that they don't really want to be there, who continues to insert herself into what's going on. And they go in the morning to the baths. And the way it's portrayed in the movie, I've never been there, there are sort of individual stalls you can go into, and the water is brought into a small tub. And you have an attendant helping you. And each woman takes their turn in the frigid water, and none of them have the experience that they expect. Maybe most notably the woman with the lump in her breast. She comes out of the water and immediately feels to see if it's still there, and it is. And she says to the attendant, "How many miracles do you see here?" And the attendant says, 62? You see 62 miracles a day? And she says, no, only 62. In the 100 years since the Virgin appeared in Lourdes, there have only been 62 miracles. And the woman realizes that her miracle cure was not a guarantee, and in fact was not even statistically probable. And she is angry and disappointed. And they all return to the hotel to discuss what has happened. The woman's young child did not magically begin to speak upon entering the water. And they have this raw and honest conversation about what they had been hoping for and how they've been disappointed. And this conversation allows them to begin to peel back the layers of miscommunication and false narratives that have contributed to this decades-long estrangement. They begin to hear and see one another in different ways. They begin a process of reconciliation that allows them to forgive one another and to figure out how to love each other again. They make their way home on the bus, all sort of speculating about how things are going to go when they get home, having snuck out and left their husbands and families behind. A little concerned about the state of their marriages. But they arrive to find that all of their husbands have had moments of transformation in their absence, and that they are all waiting for them with open arms and huge smiles when they arrive at the bus stop. This is what I think that these miracle stories in the gospel teach us today. That healing isn't guaranteed, but that physical healing is not the promise of the gospel. The promise of the gospel is not immortality. The promise of the gospel is healed relationships. The promise of the gospel is reconciliation. When the woman came to Jesus to be healed, she had been hemorrhaging for 12 years. She had likely been shunned by her family and her community. She was an outsider and an outcast. Her physical allowed her to begin the process of reconciling those relationships. But maybe, more importantly, Jesus called her daughter, and she began to reconcile with a God that she thought had abandoned her. Jairus appears loud and bold as if he is a man of deep faith. But the people around him sort of betray him. Because as soon as his daughter is dead, they're like, yeah, forget about that Jesus guy. And even though everyone in his house knows that Jesus is coming, they're still weeping and wailing and throwing a big tantrum. And they laugh when Jesus says that she is not dead. And yet, they are all amazed when they see God at work in their midst. We don't know how that changed them, but we know that encounters with Jesus change people. How were their lives transformed by this miracle? How were their relationships with one another changed? How did seed of faith that Jesus planted in that community grow and change them? How were their relationships with one another and their community reconciled? The promise of the gospel is reconciliation. It is the healing of relationships. Sometimes we have to heal the relationship we have with ourselves, sometimes with others, and almost always with God. But we know from these stories that reconciliation is always possible, that there is hope and joy even in the midst of suffering, and that we never walk this way alone. Amen.